Today on Public Research. One of the most respected historians of Jewish history, Brandeis University's Jonathan Sarna, returns to the show to discuss October 7th, reactions to it, the pogroms that spurred the Zionist movement, and how anti-Semites are weaponizing the Holocaust to attack Jews. It's really an honor to talk to you and get your perspective on this last 5 months since October 7th. First of all, what was October 7th like witnessing it? And did your mind go back to any other moments in Jewish history?
Sure. I actually heard the news in synagogue. October 7th, where we lived, was Shmini Atzeret. And people who came later than I did had heard the news, and it rapidly spread. And then the rabbi made a dramatic announcement based on what he had heard. I think we did not know all of the details at that time. And in any case, I think, and this is highly relevant, what Israelis saw on television is actually different than what Americans saw. Israelis in real time, uncensored, saw the horrors that were going on, and it's seared into their collective memory. Nothing can unsee it. Americans did not see most of those images. The major networks considered them too graphic. And so from day one, it was a different war from the perspective of people watching from America and the perspective of people in Israel. And I would have to say that remains the case to this day. I listen when I can to the Israeli radio station, which is on the internet, Kan, and I'm often struck by how different the view of the war, the sense of the country is from what I read in American newspapers. And that's notwithstanding the fact that the world is flat and all the rest of it. What comes out in Hebrew and is published there is very different than what's in English and reflected here. To come back to your question, I think like a lot of Jewishly observant Jews didn't get an immediate realization of what was going on. But soon after the holiday ended, and one could really read up and study up, it was very clear that this was a major transformative moment in modern Jewish life. I believe that there are a few such moments. 1881, when you had the great pogroms in Russia, and the hopes that had existed, oh, things will get better, there's a liberal czar, were destroyed when that czar was assassinated. you had pogroms, you had the May laws, and you had the beginning of two alternatives to Jewish life in Eastern Europe, the beginning, what were called Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion, beginning of the Zionist alternative, and of course, a significant number who began, they'd begun earlier, but who come in much larger numbers to the United States. 1881 is a turning point. Obviously, the Holocaust, one of the great turning points in Jewish history. I remember the Six-Day War, and again, one knew one had lived through a turning point. It was obviously a moment of ecstasy and happiness, quite the opposite of the mood today, but it was a transformative moment. And I think that we're going to see October the 7th in the same way. Indeed, there is a new journal with the title Watersheds, which wants to really shed light on watershed moments in Jewish life and their impact. And this will clearly be one of them.
How many people died in the famous Kishinev massacre?
I mean, it's when we look back on it, I think it was 40 odd people, and nothing compared to.
Or and what's the significance? Basically, that
Well,
basically
first of all,
started the Zionists.
well, I actually, Kirchner is 1903, and I purposely said 1881. In 1881, you had a series of pogroms, but they were only the beginning. In other words, that's the advantage of being a historian, is I can look back in time, know what happened, and you had pogroms in the 1880s, in the 1890s. As you say, you had the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. You had actually a series of pogroms in 1903 to 5, and the worst of the pogroms that actually killed thousands were in the Ukraine after World War I. There's a new book on that subject. And I would say that what we've just experienced is most similar to the pogroms in the Ukraine, because the Ukrainian pogroms really were filled with stories of rape of women, of the most brutal attacks, and really not only devastated many Jewish communities, but led to a widespread emigration and resulted in many orphans. And the same, I think, is true now. Indeed, my very distinguished colleague Ilan Troen pointed out that I think it was his grandmother was murdered in the Ukraine, and his daughter and son-in-law, alas, were murdered on Kibbutz Cholit, both in pogrom-like attacks that went after civilians and used rape and brutal murder as a kind of tool of war. But we have not seen death and destruction on this level since the Holocaust, which really means most Jews alive today have no personal memory of seeing 1,000, 1,200, I believe, Jews murdered, 100 kidnapped. We never saw anything on that scale before. And indeed, the hope had been never again. Instead, I would say that the difference between what is happening now and all those previous pogroms is that Jews are fighting back. Now, lots of people don't like that, but from the perspective of Israel, the sense is, okay, we can't stop hatred of Jews, and maybe we made serious mistakes and Jews were butchered, but at least we can fight back, and our ancestors in the Ukraine or in Russia or in Germany could not.
And as we'll talk about, it's more popular when Jews just get killed. That's when they're very popular.
Yeah.
When they can do something, then they become the demon. But we'll get to that in a second. My point with the Kishinev massacre was that was I wasn't suggesting it was the first pogrom at all, but it was a famous one that drove a lot of galvanized sort of the Zionist movement in a way. There are poems, I believe, written about it. Yeah.
Sure.
And that was, I thought the number was only 91, but you're saying it was 41?
Maybe I'm right.
Okay.
I want to look it up. It's not.
It's not over 100.
It's not over 100. It's not a big number. There were many more. In the old days, they weren't as modern as today.
Yeah.
Pogroms tended to do a great deal of property damage. There would be tremendous amount of theft, of destruction, some sexual violence that was quite popular, but you didn't have as many deaths, partly because of the weaponry available.
They didn't have machine
to
guns.
peasants. It's not a lack of will, it was simply that they didn't have them. And so we didn't see them at death at that scale. But in the Ukraine, the numbers do reach in the thousands, because the goal really, the only thing the communists and the White Army, in other words, the White Army and the Red Army, the only thing they agreed upon was that the Jews were to blame and should be ousted from the country. So both went after the Jews, which was problematic, and a reminder that it's not new that folks on the right and folks on the left attack Jews. That was precisely the case in the Ukraine. And I think it was the case in the 1930s, 40s, when Stalin was murdering Jews and Hitler was murdering Jews. The extremes tend to meet.
Right.
And both see Jews as enemies of what they are attempting to do.
My point with mentioning the number being less than 100 for this very famous pogrom is that on October 7th, it's over 1,000.
Yeah.
And
to remember.
And if you think about it, it's unlike any of these past pogroms because Jews across the world got to see it, got to see a cowering family crying as they're being basically tortured and just
Yeah.
horrible images that we could actually see.
As I say, we saw less of it than Israelis
Yeah.
saw. And I think people who knew how to find them on the internet saw many
I,
more than those who simply watched the evening news.
I watched it all on Twitter that all day long. It was horrifying for two reasons. One, the footage was horrifying, and then discovering that I was in a chat group with, I thought it was just sort of, Marxists who like to talk about conspiracy theories, and suddenly they're posting glory to the heroes,
Hmm,
and celebrating. And
hmm,
that
hmm.
was, so it was a double shock on the day. Yeah.
I've heard, uh, I remember meeting someone on the way home from synagogue services, and even though he's someone who's observant, he said, "No, I've been watching Twitter, but you shouldn't. It's too horrific to watch."
True.
And and one could see just in his face how brutal the images were. I don't know. It's an interesting question. How many American Jews or non-Jews saw the images as you did, and how many just watched the evening news? My own sense is that that's a huge difference between Israel and the United States, that in Israel, many saw it live. Um, and as I say, it's indelible, indelible in not memories, whereas in the United States, I think only people with your kinds of skills really saw it at all. But that is something that would be interesting to study.
Did you have an emotional uh,
Overwhelming, overwhelming. I mean, the person, I won't mention her name because she's actually a famous person who came into our synagogue and had heard the news. This is someone who never appears except looking her best, and she looked, she was totally dressed in black and looked like she had been through the worst horror, which she had. She had seen it. And people went over to her because of how she looked in part. And so, I think we knew, and not too long afterwards, there was an NPR report that revealed that Ilan Troen, who many of us knew, and he was my colleague, and he'd been in our area, that his daughter and son-in-law were among the murdered. And of course, that gave a face and a name to victims, and that whenever you have a face and a name, it heightens the experience. Later, there were other people. The son of one of my doctoral students is among those kidnapped. But already on the very first day, because they were murdered at Kibbutz Cholit, we heard that there were people we knew, and as time went on, other people knew folks in those in those southern Gaza kibbutzim. Vivian Silver was missing. Many people in America knew Vivian Silver, and certainly the name was known to many more. And now, of course, we know she was murdered, then she was missing. So it, I would say, it wasn't too long before we realized how horrific it was. There were many details that only became clear later, including, I have to say, the fact that the Israeli army largely wasn't there at all, and that these people were crying for help, expecting to be protected by their army, and it took sometimes 10, 12 hours in a small country for the army to appear. That wasn't as clear to me in the first minutes, but certainly became clear already that week. Partly it became clear as one tuned in to Israeli press reports, where this was very, very central.
One of your students has a child that's being held hostage?
A former student of
Sorry,
mine,
yeah.
now he's a professor, the university professor, Jonathan Deckelchain, but he did his doctorate in part. I took a class with me, and he did his doctorate at Brandeis, and and I've been in touch with him a bit. I mean, he has a son there, and actually his daughter-in-law gave birth while the son has been in Gaza. And other students of mine who settled in Israel had relatives. When I saw Facebook posts about them, it became clear to me that this wasn't, someone else's tragedy. This was a tragedy that very much hit home. I think that brings up a very important point that for Jews who are close to Israel and who have traditional sense of the familial ties among Jews, this was the death, murder, kidnapping, rape of their own relatives. I think there are other Jews who don't have that sense, a minority, but one began to see a difference between Jews who felt it and those who did not. In the circles I mix in, you only had to look at people's faces to know that they had experienced a tremendous trauma. And that was not just true around Newton and in the synagogue community. I would say that there were a great many students at Brandeis, some of them students who had studied in Israel
Right.
a year or two earlier, who were just overwhelmed by this unimaginable tragedy, and you could see that. Um, and then there were people who, just couldn't understand why Jews thought it was worse than what so many others experienced.
I'm just curious. So you observe Shabbat. Is
Yes.
that the case? Okay, so you don't do electronics
Yeah,
on Friday.
well, and
Or
Friday night, and of course it was a
right,
2 days
Saturday.
of the
Yeah.
holiday, and that's why I was not,
So
able to see it till
so
afterwards.
I'm just curious. So when this person came into your synagogue, was that morning or nighttime?
Morning.
Okay, so morning. So I assume the rabbi is maybe talking this person. I mean, was it like somebody came in and said, you got to hear this, and everybody just started
Uh,
talking?
what really happened was the rabbi had actually heard about it
Mm,
earlier on his way to services,
mm,
and he was preparing to speak about it when the Torah was taken out, because that's a moment when you had many more people in synagogue. Um, but then, as I say, this congregant came in, and later other congregants came in who had heard about the news. It's not my business how they heard about it, and brought the news to us. But the most striking um, was, as I say, this well-known person, um, totally dressed in black, and just looking at her, one knew that something terrible had happened. And so there was that visual effect as well. Remember that Simchat Torah, the joy of the Torah, which in the diaspora is celebrated a day later than in Israel, it's usually a joyous time, dancing with the Torah, where we finished the Torah cycle. And the challenge for the rabbi was how, on the one hand, to keep up the expectations of young children who people wanted to shield from this horror and who expected to sing and dance, while at the same time acknowledging that something horrific had happened, and we're plunged
wow.
into mourning, and how you balance
Wow.
those two things is excruciatingly difficult. I mean, I also knew about it because by mere chance I was scheduled in our congregation. Lay members give sermons, and I was the speaker. And I had a text in a totally different subject. It may seem like an arcane subject that I was going to speak about. Uh, it had to do with the saying of the memorial prayer Yizkor on the Sabbath, about which there is many centuries of debate. And suddenly the question was, should I give this talk at all? And I said, I'm willing to throw it out the window. And the rabbi said, no, it's still a holiday. There are probably people who came to hear you. And so I made various ad-libbed comments in within the talk, but I gave the talk that I had prepared. There are moments. Abraham Lincoln's assassination is the one that comes to mind, where indeed you hear the news in synagogue, and the question is, how do you respond? And Abraham Lincoln died on a Saturday morning after the assassination. After he was shot Friday night, he died in the morning. Telegraph had been invented, and you can really see how the news spreads across the country. And Jews were in synagogue. It was Passover, and there were many stories, and the same kinds of stories, I think, will be told about October the 7th. Oh, this is how we heard. This is how the rabbi responded. Um, but it was not something for which anybody could have prepared. And I want to say, I thought our rabbi managed to balance extremely well the different needs of the day, and acknowledging that the community wanted to mourn and pray, even as there were certain requirements of a holiday that had to be fulfilled in a traditional synagogue.
So that's October 7th.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's the reaction in America. The day of October 7th, people were posting there was a famous tweet that said, "What did you think decolonization looked like?"
Yeah.
Essays. There were people saying, "Well, it's fine because there are no Israeli civilians." Age 2, in a wheelchair, 99, they're all fair game. And I'm curious, from your vantage point of academia, how you have viewed the reaction here in the U.S.
I think that many of us would have thought that those views were extreme. I remember after 9/11, there were similarly a few voices of people who said, America deserved it. But they were, for the most part, shut down and overwhelmed. And one's initial thought was, this will be the same. And President Biden's speech, which was a marvelous speech, where he called it evil and labeled it. I think many of us thought, well, that's kind of the way Americans will take it. Of course, we now know that that was quite wrong, and nothing prepared American Jews for the onset, the many manifestations of anti-Semitism, the sense that the Jews, instead of being victims on October the 7th, were somehow responsible. And and it happened within a few weeks. And I would say that even now, all these months later, there are great feelings of betrayal, that progressive Jews felt that their allies, their friends, betrayed them. And it's common to hear people say, oh, I no longer speak to A, B, C, D after what they said. Whether you were a woman deeply involved in feminism and suddenly all sisterhood died and nobody cared about the women raped, or whether you're in Black Lives Matter and came out in favor of those who committed these horrors, or even if you're interested in saving the planet, and suddenly Greta, who was your hero, Greta Thunberg, comes out against Israel. So there is a strong sense of betrayal that one hears, and a sense of aloneness. And as I began to think about the latter, I realized that that's a very old theme. Of course, the Book of Lamentations begins with sitting alone, Yashva Vadad. During the Holocaust, one heard a lot about how alone Jews were. It's not accident that Rabbi Soloveitchik who was sitting in America during those years, wrote a famous article called "The Lonely Man of Faith." Um, Shimon Ravidovitz reflected on Jewish aloneness, and unfortunately, that theme kind of anticipated in the book of Numbers, a people that dwells alone, has recurred, and I think many pro-Israel Jews feel all alone. It's not easy or fun to be lonely, to be all alone, and nevertheless, I think Jewish institutions, synagogues have tried to help Jews take solace at this moment by giving them company within the Jewish world, since they no longer can find it in the non-Jewish world. And I'm not, that's gross generalization, but I've heard it time and again. And we are seeing, even all these months later, more people in the synagogue. And we're also seeing people who tell me, I won't talk about these issues in my place of work. Um, I know already that I'm all alone in supporting Israel, and I don't want to start. Um, One very interesting phenomenon, and we don't have numbers yet. That's why we'll only know the impact down the road. But there have been lots of reports, anecdotal reports, of people who broke up with their non-Jewish partners after October the 7th. Suddenly they realized my non-Jewish partner can't understand that part of me. Um, and I need to find a Jewish partner who does. Whether we'll actually see meaningful change in the intermarriage numbers, I don't know. But I have heard quite a few such anecdotes. I also think, and again, this has not yet been studied, but I think we will find that there is a difference between Jews who have a spouse who is a different religion, or who have one parent who is a different religion. They're in one camp, whereas Jews whose parents are both Jews and whose spouse is Jewish are in a very different camp. Um, I think that we are seeing, to some extent, in this group of Jews who, um, in Jewish Voice for Peace, and who are dissenting from the mainstream, attacking AIPAC. I think we will find that a lot of them are two groups. One, Jews who, as I say, they're one of their parents isn't Jewish, doesn't get it, or their spouse. And the other group, which we long have known, are people who left Israel angrily for one reason or another,
Well,
what Israelis call Yordim,
I got
and are still angry at Israel and can't support it. They
per-
say they've been, you called me a Yored. You said I left Israel. You scorned me. And so I'm going to get back at you. And I think we haven't yet done the sociology of these dissenters, but I think we will learn interesting things when we do those studies.
Professor, I have to say
Mhm.
this because I grew up with and I'm actually close family friends with one of the leaders of Jewish Voice for Peace. And I will tell you in her case, both parents are very Jewish,
Mhm.
famous Jewish family, uh, very left left wing. You've made the good life choice of not being, I assume, on Twitter.
No, I'm not on
And
Twitter.
I've made the bad life choice of being on Twitter, and I have to say, the experience since October 7th, it's a little bit worse than loneliness. And I'm not sure if, and I'm sorry to inform you, but I'm sure you want
Mhm.
to know just how bad it is. I actually want to screen share something with you.
Hmm.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I do. Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, well, even before Twitter,
Yeah.
anti-Semites really did those kinds of reversals because that justifies.
Uh, I
Um,
should tell the audience what it,
yeah, yeah, I
yeah,
do.
it's, so this is a tweet, and this is the handle is Socialist Steve Six, and I've bookmarked this thread because these are a great repository of basically left wing anti Semites, though many of them might deny it. And the guy is tweeting, "What's the difference between a Nazi and a Zionist?" And below are just the most vile. I mean, people saying, "Well, the Zionists are worse," but in the screenshot I'm showing the professor, there is somebody said the color of the uniforms, and then there's an AI generated anti Semitic cartoon of a Jewish man crying, and it says, "Don't you know the rules? We went through the Holocaust and now we get to kill everyone forever." Um, I, I'm sorry to share that with
No,
you.
no, no. I mean, one of the questions is whether these folks had those views beforehand, but they didn't share them. Partly because Twitter gives you anonymity, and once Twitter became X, it opened up to all sorts of extremists. But also, I think all sorts of people today are willing to engage in public anti-Semitic hatred, who were not willing to do it um, beforehand. Doesn't mean they didn't think it, but they knew it wasn't something that one talked about.
Well, the reason I showed you that is we've seen, you'll know better what to call it, what just in this moral inversion, Holocaust
Mhm.
distortion, revisionism, whatever you want to call it, where the Jews are Nazis, the Zionists are the new Nazis. You see that all the time. I think we've seen two terms be so badly abused: Nazi and genocide. And I looked it up the other day. Now people are constantly saying, "Oh, they're committing a genocide." And I looked at a site called The Intercept, which is very anti-Israel. And I saw that they had already started calling it a genocide 12 days after October 7th. And it was interesting. Somebody pointed out the Norman Finkelstein, you might know,
I don't.
apparently has said that. Do you know him?
I don't
Well,
personally,
you know
but
of
I
him.
know
Yeah.
who he is. Yeah.
He has said that Israel has committed genocide against the Palestinians 4 different times since 1982. Yet after those 4 genocides, the population has gone up dramatically, which is strange. Usually that doesn't happen.
Yeah, Jews, of course, invented the word genocide after the Armenians, but it was, if you look at the history of the term and the idea, this kind of inversion is by no means unprecedented, but we didn't expect to see it, even though you can find in the 1930s, in the literature of the Nazi Bund and among proud anti-Semites at that time, similar ideas. Oh, the Jews are getting us into war, not Hitler. And even I've taught it, anti-Semitic literature that argued that the Jews have a plan to wipe out the Goyim. And of course, that justifies, if I believe, I mean, they use that word, which is found in Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but if you believe that Jews are out to murder all of the Gentiles, that of course allows the Gentiles to murder you, which is their aim in the first place. We thought those days were in the past, and I think this has been a salutary reminder that it's not so. I think also that the events we've experienced should remind us that often the world does not move progressively in linear fashion,
Yep.
getting better and better. Many Jews believed that, anti-Semitism declined decade by decade since World War II. And indeed, they thought it's finished. There was a book, The Death of Anti-Semitism, and famous and good scholars argued that, anti-Semitism would be like, I don't know, anti-Catholicism in America. Once Catholics and Protestants killed each other, and now nobody remembers that. And I think young people believe that. And when we look at the history of the 21st century, it's really a history of the return of anti-Semitism. We saw more and more anti-Semitism on the right in the wake of 9/11 already. There was considerable anti-Semitism on January 6th among the group that involved in the insurrection. And then you had you also had Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and so on. And now we realize, although some of those were Charlottesville and Pittsburgh were anti-Semites on the right, we now realize that the same phenomenon existed on the left, and Jews understand that they have actually three enemies on the extreme right, on the extreme left, and Islamists. Colleyville was a good example of Islamist anti-Semitism. And that's what makes this a very complicated, I would say frightening time for Jews. And there is, I think, a growing realization parallel to the 30s. There's nowhere to escape to. If you think it's bad for Jews in America, it's much worse, really, in many other countries. I have relatives in England and England, France. These are Latin America places where there have been horrific attacks, and Jews are not there in the numbers that we are seeing, and the leadership is not as sympathetic. Our leadership hasn't been perfect, but it certainly has not attacked Jews. in the way that, say, Turkey's leadership has. Um, so,
I,
it's quite problematic.
I,
And um, I think Jews know that there is nowhere really where they can enjoy the kind of uh, freedom and and freedom from prejudice that in some ways they had expected to be able to enjoy based on the experience, say, of the 1990s.
I don't think they actually believe the way they're throwing around these terms of Zionists or the new Nazis and genocide for two reasons. If they actually believe that about Zionists, for instance, then if you believe that, you look at the Tree of Life massacre. I'm pretty sure most of the victims were supporters of Israel, so Zionists. If they believe that, that was not an anti-Semitic shooting. Really, it was a shooting between Nazi subgroups. I mean, that's how absurd that idea is. And then, if they believe this is a genocide where Israel calls 1,000 phone numbers in the area they're going to bomb to tell civilians to evacuate, deliver food aid. I don't think they were delivering food aid to the Armenians as the Turks drove them into the desert to die. If they actually believed it was a genocide, when Hamas refuses a ceasefire deal, they should be outraged. They should be, I mean, can you imagine a headline from 1944? Auschwitz Jews refuse deal to shut down gas chamber. Could you imagine? I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy. So let's get into academia. Do you know Alan Dershowitz?
Yeah, sure.
I want to play this clip from him for you.
When schools created ethnic studies programs, Black studies programs, Hispanic studies programs, women's studies programs, you know what the worst ones are? The worst ones are Jewish studies programs. Many of the most virulent anti-Israel rhetoric comes from Jewish studies programs. You know why?
Why?
Who are the professors there? They're third-rate Israeli professors who couldn't get a job at Hebrew University or Technion or Tel Aviv University. So they come and they try to get jobs in America teaching in Jewish studies programs. Now, there are so many of them and they're so mediocre that in order to get a job, they have to be a talking dog. And what's a talking dog? An Israeli who hates Israel. So the Israelis who hate Israel tend to get the jobs in Jewish studies departments. And so many of the Jewish studies departments have taken the lead against Israel. I'm in favor of abolishing every single ethnic studies program in America.
And I could show you, I have a clip of a guy named Raz Siegel, who actually is an Israeli academic who came here. He's the guy who was like a few weeks after October 7th, it's a genocide. Israel's doing a genocide. What is your take?
Well, I'm a little worried about the idea that we generalize about 4,000 colleges and universities. My congressman, Thomas P. O'Neill, used to say all politics is local. To some extent, the same is true about anti-Semitism. Yes, there are Jewish studies departments that, for various reasons, including those that Professor Dershowitz articulated, are full of people who hate Israel and who I think felt that in order to gain acceptance, they had to sever ties with the Jewish community and with normative Jewish views. There are other Jewish studies departments that, of course, are quite different. There's now a whole organization on the web of professors of Jewish studies who support Israel and defend it. But I would certainly insist, and unless any listeners not
Sorry, I was trying to be provocative, I
yeah,
guess.
not a problem.
My,
My
uh,
own Jewish Studies department at Brandeis University couldn't be more different uh, than what Professor Dershowitz set forth, and I would even say that Harvard's is a little different than what he says. But that said, it's not like all extreme. There are elements of truth there. The whole world of scholarly activism, so different from the dispassionate scholar model that I was trained in and frankly believe in, has indeed been deeply problematic. You can't simultaneously be a dispassionate scholar, objective, open to all of the evidence, and in command of as wide a group of facts as possible, and then also be an activist who wants to change society and has all sorts of passions rather than dispassion. And as we saw the humanities and social sciences fill up with scholar activists, then I'm sorry to say, truth increasingly and pursuit of truth and pursuit of dispassion went out the window. And that's tragic. I think we are paying a huge price for that, not only as Jews, but as Americans. Um, and it has made universities deeply contentious. I mean, long before October 7th, we began to see an astonishing thing. University departments putting out statements and different societies of academics putting out political statements. Once upon a time, you were very pleased. Oh, I have people who believe this, people who believe that. We have people with different perspectives, and the idea that they should all sign on a common statement would have been utterly repugnant. You wanted Republicans and Democrats. You wanted experts on different religions, conservatives and liberals, and the like. The minute folks are making statements, you are really shutting down those who are of a different view. And that is the antithesis of what the academy is supposed to be about. And tragically, all sorts of departments and scholarly societies across the United States devote a lot of time to making statements.
Can I'm so, there's so many young Jewish anti-Zionists. It's very trendy.
Yeah.
And they have no memory of the Holocaust. They have no memory of the helplessness of Jews in 1939. So make the case. I'll play them and I'll say, Israel should be a one state. We don't need this. It's ethno-nationalist. It's not fair. We should basically get rid of the Jewish safe haven state. What would be your response?
I think that we have seen what it means when peoples have a state of their own, that when you knock, they have to take you in. The Irish take in the Irish, Italians, the Italian. Actually, Germans were expelled from many countries in the 30s and the 40s. Romania expelled, they called them Saxons, and expelled thousands and thousands of them. And Germany had to Germany took them in. That's really the beauty of having a state. And the reason there was a Jewish state is, one reason was because the whole world saw that people wanted to expel the Jews, and there was nowhere that took them in. Indeed, a lot of leftist Jews like to talk about tikkun olam, and nothing has so improved the world and has saved so many lives and has been so important for human rights as the fact that expelled Jews, whether they were expelled from Arab land or they were persecuted in the former Soviet Union or in Latin America or in Africa, they knew that they could come to Israel, and Israel took them in, welcomed them, and turned them into citizens, not into refugees. And that's why we need a Jewish state. And I would say that even now, if God forbid anything happened to Israel, I don't think even the United States of America would take in the 7 million Jews currently reside in Israel. Countries don't like taking in large groups of immigrants. And so having a nation state is a great guarantee of that kind of safety, just like a lot of people want to have an American citizenship, knowing that no matter where you are, the fact that you've got American citizenship opens up your ability to have American protection. I think that the folks who wonder, should there be an Israel, should ask themselves, would they themselves want to be in a position that no country really would accept them as citizens, that they had no strong identity, no strong group that would take them in. I think very few of them would want to be in that position. The truth of the matter is, of course, that it's Israel's neighbors will not take in Jews, and over again they've insisted, we want to have peace. Well, all the Jews have to leave. Israel has not made the same demand about its Arab citizens. And I don't know anybody in Israel who would, even after what has happened, who feel that they would be better off if there were no Israel. That doesn't mean you have to agree with every policy, but the notion that Jews have a land seems to me is as easy to defend as the notion that Germans, French, Irish, and Italians should have a country of their own. And I don't see them giving that up. And the interesting thing is, even those academics who theorized once that, oh, there'll be a common market and there'll be one great big country of Europe, and all those so-called invented identities would disappear. Well, it turned out not to be the case at all, as the British case demonstrates and others as well. And it turns out that there's much more to that kind of identity than academic theorists imagined.
And as you know, there were Jews having the original Zionist versus anti-Zionist argument in Poland. And one of the Jews who agreed with you was named David Ben-Gurion. He left Poland, and the Bund and the anti-Zionist Jews, what happened to them, sadly?
Yes, tragically, I think that
they were killed by Hitler.
The battle over Zionism before the state is not the same as after the state, in the same way that prior to the American Revolution, there were all sorts of people. Should we rebel against England, or shouldn't we rebel against England? But once there was an American Revolution, yes, there were some who left or were pushed out, and others understood the benefits of the new situation and built with it. And the same is true in Israel. It was a very beautiful idea. Jews should be able to live everywhere. Diaspora nationalism. All countries should take in Jews. But of course, like a lot of beautiful ideas, it turned out to be utopian, and unfortunately, those who believed them paid an enormous price.
I would suggest anti-Zionist Jews watch the Ken Burns documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. And that's what the world would be like for Jews without Israel, which is, as I say, it would just be a return to basically begging.